June 18, 2018, the news broke at 5:47 in the afternoon. Within minutes, every major music outlet in the world had stopped running its scheduled content. Twitter was moving faster than anyone could read. Instagram was flooded. YouTube comments sections on videos that had nothing to do with him were filling up with the same words over and over. Again, he is really gone. Jossie Dwayne Ricardo Onfroy, known to the world as XXXTentacion, had been shot and killed outside a motorcycle dealership in Deerfield Beach, Florida. He was 20 years old, but 12 hours before that moment, 12 hours before the world changed, something happened that almost nobody knows about. Something that the people who were there have spent years trying to find the right words to describe. Something that, depending on how you look at it, is either the saddest thing you will ever hear or the most beautiful. There was a studio session, and there was a song, and XXXTentacion walked out of that studio smiling. This is that story. To understand what happened on the night of June 17, 2018, you have to understand what kind of person XXXTentacion was in a studio. Not on stage, not on social media, not in the legal battles that had followed him for years, but in a studio, alone, with a microphone and a beat, and nothing to prove to anyone. Because that version of him was completely different from every other version the public had seen. People who worked with him in his final months describe the same thing over and over again. They describe a young man who would go completely silent the moment the session started. All the energy, all the chaos, all the intensity that defined his public presence, it would just disappear. He would put on the headphones, he would close his eyes, and he would listen to the beat for sometimes 10, 15, 20 minutes without saying a single word. Just breathing, just listening, like he was having a conversation with something nobody else in the room could hear. Carlos Morales, a sound engineer who had worked with XXXTentacion on multiple sessions during the final year of his life, described it this way: working with him in the studio felt less like a professional session and more like being allowed to witness something private. Like you had been given permission to watch someone pray. The night of June 17th began the way most of his late sessions began. He arrived after midnight. He came alone. He had no entourage, no hype, no performance. He walked in wearing the kind of clothes you wear when you are not trying to impress anyone. Dark, loose, simple. He had a bottle of water. He had his phone. He sat down in the chair across from the console, and he said almost nothing for the first 15 minutes. The engineer on duty that night, whose identity has been kept private at the request of people close to XXXTentacion's estate, later spoke about what happened in a series of private conversations that were shared with a small number of journalists and documentarians in the years following his death. What follows is drawn from those accounts, from interviews with people present at various points of the session, and from the recollections of individuals who were in contact with XXXTentacion in the hours before and after that night. The beat that was pulled up first was not the one that would eventually become the song. It was something harder, more aggressive, the kind of production that had defined his earliest work. The material that had made people pay attention to him in the first place when he was still an unknown teenager, uploading tracks to SoundCloud from a phone in a juvenile detention facility. He listened to it for about 4 minutes, then he shook his head. Not dramatically, not with frustration, just a small, quiet movement that said, "Not this one, not tonight." The second beat was something entirely different, slower, more. There was a quality to it that the engineer would later describe as feeling like 3 in the morning in a city where everyone you love is asleep. It had piano, it had silence in it, actual silence, deliberate gaps in the production where nothing played, and the ear was left with nothing to hold on to. Those silences, in music, are harder to create than the sounds. They require a kind of confidence that most producers never develop. The person who made this beat understood something about grief and about beauty that very few people who have not experienced real loss are able to understand. XXXTentacion heard the first 8 bars and sat up straighter in his chair. He did not say anything. He just listened to it play through once, then again, then a third time. On the 4th play, he reached out and put his hand flat on the console, not pressing anything, just resting his palm on it like he was steadying himself. The engineer noticed but said nothing. You learned, working with XXXTentacion, that there were moments you did not interrupt. After the 6th or 7th play of the beat, he stood up and went into the booth. He did not write anything down first. He did not pace or warm up or go through the kind of preparatory rituals that many artists rely on before they record. He put the headphones on, adjusted the microphone to exactly the height he wanted it. He was always specific about this, always insisted on positioning it himself, and he stood there for a long moment with his eyes closed. Then he started to sing. What came out in those first few takes was not polished. It was not ready. It was the thing that exists before the song, the raw material of emotion before it has been shaped into something shareable. His voice cracked in places. He stopped midway through lines, shook his head, came back out of the booth, asked for the beat again, went back in. This happened 4 or 5 times. Each time he came back out, he seemed to go somewhere else in his mind for a moment. Not frustrated, not discouraged, but searching. Like he was trying to find the exact right door into a room he already knew was there. The engineer later said that this part of the session, the part before anything came together, was the most intense he had ever experienced in years of working in studios. Not because of what was being said or sung, but because of the quality of the silence between the attempts. The way XXXTentacion would stand in the control room with his eyes closed and breathe. The way the room felt like it was holding its breath along with him. Sometime around 2 in the morning, something shifted. He went back into the booth for what would turn out to be the final time that night. He asked for the beat. It started playing. He waited through the intro, all the way to the moment where it opened up, where the silence he had noticed from the beginning first appeared, and then he sang the opening line. The engineer said he felt it immediately. He said it was one of those moments in music where you stop being a professional doing a job and become simply a person in the presence of something real. He said his hands froze over the console. He said the only thing he could think was, do not mess this up, do not breathe wrong, do not move, just let it happen. XXXTentacion recorded the song in 1 take, not one perfect take after many imperfect ones, 1 take. He started at the beginning, and he went all the way to the end without stopping, without hesitating, without coming back out of the booth to start again. His voice did things in that take that, according to everyone who has heard the recording, seem almost impossible for a 20-year-old who had no formal vocal training to do. There were moments where he went so quiet that the microphone had to work to find him. There were moments where something broke open in his voice. Not a crack, not a mistake, but the kind of controlled breaking that the greatest singers in the world spend decades learning how to do on purpose. When the last note ended, the booth went silent. He stood there for a moment with his eyes still closed and his hands at his sides. Then he opened his eyes. He looked through the glass at the engineer. He did not say, "Was that good?" He did not say, "Let me hear it back." He did not say anything at all for what the engineer remembers as a very long time. Then he said 3 words, "Play it back." The engineer played it back. XXXTentacion stood in the booth and listened to himself sing through the glass, through the speakers, his own voice coming back to him. He listened to the whole thing from beginning to end without moving. When it finished, he took off his headphones. He put them on the microphone stand. He came out of the booth. He stood in the middle of the control room, which was a small room, not much more than a closet with equipment in it, and he said that is the one. The engineer asked him if he wanted to do another take. Standard procedure, a safety take, something to work with in case anything needed to be adjusted in post. XXXTentacion shook his head. "That is the one," he said again. "Do not touch it." There is a particular kind of certainty that artists have about their best work. It is not arrogance. It is not performance. It is the opposite of those things. It is very quiet. It is very still. It does not need anyone else to confirm it, because it comes from somewhere that other people's opinions cannot reach. The engineer, who had worked with a significant number of artists across a significant number of years, recognized it immediately. He had seen it maybe 3 or 4 times in his career. He was seeing it now. He did not push for another take. XXXTentacion picked up his bottle of water. He checked his phone. He stood in the room for a moment longer, looking at nothing in particular. Or maybe at everything. It is hard to say. Then he said goodnight to the engineer. He walked out of the studio into the Florida night, which was warm and dark and quiet in the way that Florida nights are in June when the day's heat has finally let go of the air. He was smiling. The engineer watched him go. He sat alone in the control room with the song on the hard drive and the silence in the room where the music had been. He did not go home for another 2 hours. He sat there with the song and thought about what he had just witnessed. He would later say that he did not fully understand what he had witnessed until the following afternoon when the news came through. The song was never released. This is the part of the story that people find the hardest to accept. In the years since XXXTentacion's death, an enormous amount of music has been released from his archive. Music recorded during his lifetime, demos, unfinished material, collaborations. His estate has worked carefully and extensively to share what he left behind with the people who loved him. But this song, the one from the night of June 17th, the last song he ever finished, has never appeared on any album, any streaming platform, any posthumous release. The people close to his estate who know about it have said very little publicly. What has been shared, in fragments and in private, suggests that there is a reason for this, that the decision not to release it is not an oversight or a legal complication or a business decision. That it is something closer to a choice made out of respect for what the song is and what it means and what it would mean to put it out into a world that would consume it and contextualize it and make it into something it was never meant to be. Some things are not meant for everyone. Some things are made for the moment they exist in. And the moment that song existed in was a recording booth in Florida in the middle of the night with one other person in the room and a young man who somehow found in what would turn out to be the last creative act of his life exactly the thing he had been trying to say for as long as he had been making music. What was the song about? People who have heard it are reluctant to say much. The details feel private in a way that is difficult to explain. What they say consistently is this: it did not sound like someone who knew he was going to die. It sounded like someone who was finally at peace. It sounded like someone who had set something down, something heavy, something carried for a long time, and was breathing freely for the first time in years. It sounded like an arrival, not an ending, an arrival. To understand why that matters, you have to understand what the last years of XXXTentacion's life had actually been like. Not the version that the headlines told. And the headlines were brutal, and some of the things in them were true, and none of that is being ignored here. But the internal experience of being him, of carrying what he carried, of having grown up the way he grew up and survived what he survived, and then been placed without any real preparation, in front of millions of people who all wanted different things from him at the same time. He had grown up with violence. He had grown up in instability, in poverty, in a world where the people who were supposed to protect children often could not or did not. He had been incarcerated as a teenager. He had fought publicly and privately, and with himself in ways that left marks on everyone around him. He was not a simple person, and his story is not a simple story, and anyone who tries to tell it simply is not telling it truthful. But he was also undeniably an artist. Not an artist in the diluted commercial sense of someone who makes products for a market. An artist in the older, more serious sense of the word, someone who takes what is most painful and most confusing and most impossible to articulate about being alive and attempts to shape it into something that other people can hold. His music at its best did something that very little music does. It made people who were suffering feel less alone in their suffering, not by offering solutions, not by promising that things would be okay, but by saying, "I know this feeling. I have been here. You are not the only one." Millions of people heard that in his music, and it changed something in them. Young people in particular. Young people who were struggling, who were isolated, who did not know how to talk about the things that were happening inside them, found in his music a vocabulary for experiences they had never been able to name. That is not a small thing. That is one of the most important things that music can do. And he was 20 years old when he died and had already done it for more people than most artists reach in a lifetime. The night of June 17th, in that small studio, something came together that had been coming together for a long time. All the searching, all the pain, all the unfinished conversations with himself. Somehow, in the dark, alone with a microphone and a beat that felt like 3 in the morning, it found its form. He recorded it in one take. He said that is the one. He walked out smiling. 12 hours later, the world learned what it had lost, and the song sat on a hard drive in a studio in Florida, finished and perfect and private. The last true thing he ever made, waiting in the silence where he had left it. There is a version of this story that ends with a plea, a call to release the music, to let the world hear it, to give his fans the final piece of what he left behind. This is not that version, because the people who have heard it seem to understand something that is worth understanding, that not everything that is made needs to be shared, that some things are complete exactly as they are, in the place they were made, in the moment they were made in, that the song existing is enough, that him finishing it is enough, that him walking out of that studio smiling into the warm Florida night with the certainty that he had finally said exactly what he needed to say. That is enough. XXXTentacion spent most of his short life being defined by other people, by the media that covered him, by the legal system that processed him, by the fans who loved him, and the critics who condemned him, and the industry that tried to figure out what to do with someone who refused to be categorized. He was loud, and he was difficult, and he was contradictory, and he was, in the ways that matter most, deeply and profoundly human. But on the last night of his creative life, in a small room with one other person and a microphone and a beat with silence built into it, he was only himself, and he made something true. And he knew it was true, and he held that knowledge for 12 hours before the world took everything else. The song is called by different names by different people who know about it. No official title was ever given. Some call it simply the last song. Others do not call it anything at all, because naming it feels like claiming it, and it does not belong to them. It belongs to the silence it came from. It belongs to the booth where he stood with his eyes closed and his hands at his sides. It belongs to the engineer who sat frozen at the console and thought, "Do not breathe wrong." It belongs to the Florida night that was warm and dark and quiet. It belongs to him, and he finished it. He really finished it. In a life that was full of things left incomplete, of sentences cut off midway, of promises interrupted by circumstances outside his control, he finished this one. He stood in the control room and said, "That is the one. Do not touch it." And he picked up his water and he checked his phone and he walked out into the night smiling. That is the story. That is the whole story. A young man went into a studio on the last night of his life and made something beautiful and true and knew that it was beautiful and true and walked away from it at peace. Whatever else is said about him, whatever else is true, whatever the full and complicated and painful accounting of his life eventually concludes. He finished the song. He walked out smiling. Some things are enough.